We begin in Mali, where the French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius says the government must provide adequate security in the north of the country to enable all Malians to take part in July's election. Fabius made the comments during a visit to the country on Tuesday.
French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius said his visit to the war-torn country is to discuss measures that will allow people in northern MNLA strongholds such as Kidal to vote in the upcoming polls. Fabius insists that the Malian authorities must be in control of northern areas if the July elections are anything to go by.
A governor will be present in Kidal, like in all other regions, and the army too. We must have Mali symbols present there. It's obvious we can't have two armies in the same country.
Fabius's Bamako stop came just hours after he met with top officials in Niger, where he urged African nations to make a concerted effort to tackle a growing Islamist threat in the region. Despite a French-led military drive against rebels in the north, Islamist fighters continue to mount sporadic attacks in the north and several towns, including Kidal. This has raised doubts that elections scheduled for July 28th can go forward safely and throughout the country. Malian President Djinkunda Traoré, however, shares different thoughts.
The first round of the presidential elections, as I had previously announced, will take place before July 31st everywhere, including in Kidal. The Malian army will be in Kidal and the Malian flag will fly in Kidal.
A 5-month French-led military campaign broke Islamists' hold over the northern two-thirds of Mali earlier this year. Hundreds of al-Qaeda-linked fighters were killed, pushing others into neighboring states. Maria Galang, CCTV.
Niger's President Mahamadou Issoufou has attended funerals and met with the grieving relatives of those killed in last week's suicide bombings. He flew into the northern city of Agadez, where Islamic militants attacked a military camp and a uranium mine, killing 35 people. The French Foreign Minister, Laurent Fabius, who made a stopover in Niger, suggested that the attackers could have had help from within. President Issoufou had earlier said the al-Qaeda-linked militants most likely came from southern Libya. However, Libyan authorities have denied this. These attacks have raised concerns that extremists formerly based in northern Mali have regrouped in neighboring countries. Now let's move to Egypt, where a group of young campaigners, a group of young Egyptians, have launched what they're calling the Rebellion Campaign. They're collecting signatures from members of the public who say they no longer trust President Mohamed Morsi. The group held a press conference on Wednesday to discuss the campaign's progress and launch their online website. Adil Mahrouki went to find out more.
A group of young activists have caught the attention of national and global media after launching the Tamarrud or Rebellion campaign, trying to push President Morsi from power. They collect signatures, withdrawing trust from the president. In 1 month, they said they collected 2 million signatures. 4 weeks later, they held this press conference to announce their new count.
The number suppresses 7.5 million signatures. This means that before June 30th, we will exceed our 15 million target, which is an indication that Morsi's popularity is diminishing in the streets. Because we are just a few youth who have extremely limited resources, yet we got 7.5 million supporters.
The campaign has quickly gained popularity among the opposition lines. It has also drifted protests away from the streets. Activists are now only focused to collect signatures and prepare for the June 30th protest, which will mark Morsi's first anniversary in power.
When we reach 15 million signatures, it will send a message to the entire world that the Egyptian people do not want the president in power. According to the constitution, the people are the source of authority. With the absence of parliament, the people themselves are speaking out instead.
I am against the campaigning because we rebel. It can't be against the democracy that we have finally attained. How can they demand to remove a president who has been elected for 4 years? Also, we can't judge him and evaluate him because the 4 years after this period, if we don't like him, then we can rebel and choose someone else.
The Muslim Brotherhood welcomed any forms of freedom of expression. It, however, stressed that the campaign has no legal basis to overthrow a democratically elected president.
Regardless of whether this president is from an Islamic stream or not, Egypt will never be able to develop. We can never reach consensus on one person. So if we remove a president before his time, no president will remain in power. There will always be opposition, and there will always be those who don't like him. The only way is to be patient and give the president the stability that will allow him to work.
Tamarrud aims to reach 15 million votes by June 30th, a number that surpasses the total of votes President Morsi won in both phases of the presidential elections. The rebellion campaign once again ignited the political battle in Egypt, but this time far from the streets. While they claim they have 7 million signatures, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamic Stream doubt they have such support, and they both will wait for the June 30th protest to show who is right. Adel Mahroui, CCTV, Cairo.
Regional conflict experts are warning that the deployment of a United Nations intervention brigade to eastern DRC could result in even greater instability in the region. One DR Congo conflict researcher says the situation in Goma is very volatile and that a lot of people in the North Kivu province are concerned about what will happen if M23 rebels clash with the UN force. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon last week said the intervention brigade would be deployed to eastern DRC in weeks to come. Now, here's CCTV's Isabel Nakiria with more details of that story.
The UN hopes the deployment of an intervention brigade can calm the situation in eastern DRC. But in Goma, there are real concerns that the fate of civilians has not been properly considered. Speaking on telephone from Goma, one conflict researcher says it's civilians that will suffer if more planning is not done.
I mean, as of now, the UN has been in the country for 10 years, and they do have protection of civilian programs in place. And I understand that they're also very diligently trying to improve on these protection mechanisms. But certainly, I mean, there is a risk, there's a serious risk that many people will be displaced if this deployment of the military intervention brigade goes wrong and is not properly coordinated and well planned.
The war in Congo has left over 900,000 people displaced and seeking refuge in neighboring countries, according to various estimates from research groups. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on his recent visit to Kampala said he regretted the situation in eastern DRC and could not wait to have the intervention brigade deployed. The Congolese M23 group has accused the UN of a deliberate move to attack them by deploying the UN intervention brigade. 3,000 troops from Tanzania, Malawi and South Africa make up the brigade that has started arriving in Goma. Mr. Ban last week appealed to the rebels to abandon armed rebellion and return to the discussion table in Kampala. But he stressed that the UN intervention brigade would protect civilians.
This force of 3,000 troops has a robust mandate to enforce peace and protect civilians. It will be fully operational in a matter of weeks. But that is only one element of a broader political process. A peace deal must deliver a peace dividend, health, education, jobs, and opportunity.
It's feared the Congolese army and M23 rebels could clash again, and this leaves tens of thousands at risk. In recent clashes, at least 9 people died. But despite his concerns, Timo Mwela says with proper planning, all hope is not lost. Last week, the M23 appealed for immediate cessation of hostilities to enable Mr. Ban's visit, which they said could be a good gesture to enable both parties sign a peace deal. Despite appeals by the UN chief for the Congo government and the M23 rebels to come back to the discussion table, this has not yet happened. Now, conflict experts said this leaves a lot of anxiety hanging over Congo. Isabel Nakiria, CCTV, Kampala.
AfricaLive returns just after the short break with more, including a spirited fight. Africa registers gains in the fight against HIV. And we ask, what next for Sudan and South Sudan relations after the recent spat?
We follow the the latest trends in global politics, economics, culture and sport, and how Africa fits into the global picture. You decide what's important.
We need a trade justice.
Africa's future will be determined by Africa.
For women's equal opportunity, for a better life.
We have to change something, and it's not the outsiders.
Talk Africa, a new voice for the world.
Welcome back. Now, Zimbabwe is celebrating success in the fight against HIV/AIDS. A recent UN AIDS report has cited the country as a leading light in the provision of antiretroviral therapy, especially to expectant mothers. Zimbabwe boasts universal access for the population in need of antiretroviral therapy, with services decentralized to the most remote parts of the country. CCTV's Farai Mokatuya sought to find out how the nation has been able to achieve this success.
As at December 2012, Zimbabwe had 518,000 people on antiretroviral treatment, representing 95.1% of the population in need of therapy. This performance has been achieved on the back of increased funding from international donors and mobilization of resources from a national AIDS levy to which all formerly employed Zimbabweans contribute. The country has scored its greatest success in prevention of mother-to-child transmission. Over 90% of HIV-positive pregnant women are accessing treatment.
Our setting is made in such a way that we are able to reach every remote area in this country. We have structures and we have health centers in every ward or every village has access to these services. So we are mobilizing mothers and making sure that they seek maternity services in health centers. And then we give them the access to PMTCT services.
There are, however, some hurdles that need to be overcome.
The only challenge that we are facing in that regard is male participation. We have fewer males who are still going with their pregnant women, or let me say wife, because you have to accompany your partner to seek this service so that you are also screened for HIV if you are found positive so that you can access treatment.
Authorities have also acknowledged the need to improve access to pediatric patients. Currently, only 42% of HIV-positive infants are receiving drugs. Authorities say this is due to the specialized nature of testing and equipment needed to diagnose HIV in children.
The process now was quite long. It takes about 6 months or so. So we are really worried about this, and we have seen this as a limitation. And currently we have since made strategies of trying to decentralize this service because it has been centralized.
Under the new structure, health personnel are being trained and equipped to test blood samples at district level, which would reduce the need to refer to a centralized national laboratory. At one point, HIV/AIDS had been declared a national disaster, threatening to decimate Zimbabwe's population. However, today the nation is singing a totally different tune as authorities here celebrate the massive strides made in rolling back the impact of this epidemic. Farai Mokatuya, CCTV, Harare, Zimbabwe.
Well, the Joint United Nations Programme report on HIV/AIDS says the number of people in Africa who receive antiretroviral drugs has now risen from 1 million in 2005 to more than 7 million in 2012. Then again, you have to remember the continent accounts for nearly 70% of people living with the virus worldwide. Now, to discuss this further, Mark Haywood, an HIV/AIDS activist and the executive director for Section 27, which incorporates the AIDS Law Project in South Africa, joins us from our studio in Johannesburg. Welcome to Africa Live. Now, Mr. Haywood, what is your reaction to those numbers released in this latest UN report?
Good evening. Well, it's a very positive reaction. As you've mentioned, just over a decade ago, any person in Africa who was infected with HIV almost inevitably got sick and died of AIDS. Most people died of AIDS, and we had millions of people across the continent dying every year. In South Africa, we had a situation, for example, where nearly 400,000 people died per year, over 1,000 people per day. Now, with the rollout of antiretroviral treatment across the continent, the deaths are declining and we're beginning to make progress. But I must say that the progress is by no means secure.
Now, you have mentioned progress has been made. We've seen that in Zimbabwe as well as Botswana. But what are the challenges that remain in sub-Saharan countries, including South Africa?
Well, I think one major challenge is just the funding of AIDS programs. Antiretroviral treatment is much, much cheaper today than it was a few years ago. But with the exception of South Africa and one or two other countries, most African countries are very, very heavily dependent on the United States, on the European Union, on the Global Fund to fund their AIDS programs and their HIV interventions. Now, unfortunately, there is declining political will in developed countries to fund HIV, which means that the big test is whether our governments in Africa are going to be prepared to pick up the funding gap to make sure that we keep people on treatment and that we keep people alive.
Now, you've looked at that funding, saying that there is a problem in terms of those countries coming to the party. Previously, many sub-Saharan governments have promised to finance the fight against HIV/AIDS through the procurement of life-prolonging drugs like ARVs. What is happening with the money that should be ploughed into the fight against HIV/AIDS, and why is there a problem in getting governments to fully commit?
Well, I'm afraid I have to speak honestly here as an activist, which is that, many of our governments have wrong priorities. They are spending money, domestically raised money out of our fiscus on issues which are not social priorities for the majority of people. And that is something that clearly we have to turn around. Healthcare as a whole does not get the financial support that it requires. It is not just HIV. And we need to prioritize healthcare. We need to prioritize the lives of people in Africa. And we also need to prioritize improving the social conditions in which we live in Africa, because that will reduce the risk that people face of being infected with HIV. And this continent, because we live in very difficult conditions, we have a much higher risk of HIV infection than, say, somebody who lives in Europe or the United States.
All right, thank you very much. We'll have to leave it there. Mark Haywood, an HIV/AIDS activist and the Executive Director for Section 27, speaking to us from Johannesburg. Now, South Sudan says it's committed to peace deals signed with Sudan. The statement comes a day after Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir threatened to close oil pipelines between the two countries indefinitely. Bashir is accusing South Sudan of backing rebels on Sudanese soil, an allegation it denies. As CCTV's Garim Challa reports, relations have indeed worsened between the two in the past few days.
Going back to the old brow, Sudan and South Sudan are at the age of disagreements again. Sudan now says it will close a pipeline carrying oil exports from South Sudan if Juba continues to support rebels operating on Sudanese soil. The longtime foes agreed to resume cross-border oil flows in March, but relations have worsened in the past days over Sudan's accusations, which are denied by South Sudan. Following this incident, Sudanese President Omar Hassan al-Bashir said to a large crowd in Khartoum he will give his South Sudanese brothers last warning that his government will shut down the oil pipeline forever if South Sudan continues supporting insurgents in Darfur, South Kordofan and Blue Nile regions.
To our brothers in South Sudan, we say that we have signed agreements and we are committed to those agreements. But if you violate any of those agreements, we shall cancel them. This is a final message. They continue supporting the rebels, then the agreements will be cancelled.
South Sudan reiterated it did not support the Sudan Revolutionary Front, which says it wants to end what it calls a domination of Khartoum, at least in the African country. The Information Minister Baranaba Mariel Benjamin said his government is not supporting any rebel groups against neighboring Sudan, urging Khartoum to address any bilateral problems through an African Union panel which brokered the March deal. Landlocked South Sudan, which became independent from the North in 2011, needs to use northern oil facilities to sell its crude and have any hope of propping up its economy. And now, if Sudan and South Sudan go back to their old brow, the peace process that brought the much-needed peace and stability in the region will absolutely be dwarfed. Gromjala, CCTV, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
It's time now for another break. When we come back, dashed hopes, businesses in Central African Republic count losses as rebels reign supreme. And up for grabs, South African artist seeks local buyer for Mandela portrait.
With the advent of science and telescopes, humans have looked deeper and deeper into the sky, gradually explaining more and more of the universe. Mauritian radio astronomer Nadim Uzair is part of the construction of the most powerful radio telescope in the world. With its headquarters in Cape Town and radio dishes in the remote Karoo Desert, the square-kilometre array will provide data to answer humankind's most fundamental questions about the universe. Where did it come from, and of what is it made?
Businesses in the Central African Republic are counting huge losses since rebels overthrew former President Francois Bozize. The rebels have taken advantage of lawlessness in the country to enrich themselves and destroy personal property. Kofa Mrenje reports.
When Christian Wado returned home from abroad, his main aim was to have a positive impact in the society in one of the poorest countries in Africa. But first, he set up a small accommodation business as he tried to settle down after being away for about 20 years. However, just a few months later, on the 24th of March 2013, when rebels captured the capital Bangui, all hell broke loose.
It makes you feel really bad, in the sense that when you look around the region, for example, you look about, what the world talks about Central Africa, it gives you a lot of pain when you are born from this place.
He has painfully watched over the past 2 months rebels come into his business premises, force him to give them rooms where they spend the night without paying. What was meant to help him settle down has now been turned into a barracks for rebels, and business has been on the downfall since then.
The presence of people with uniforms, especially the army, their movement around actually sends a lot of fear among the people, and that actually makes people not to feel like moving freely to do what they want. And in the process, some of us who are in business, you end up losing greatly.
Across the country, and especially in the capital Bangui, many have suffered the same fate. Some have been forcefully evicted from their houses and rebel commanders taken over the houses. Shops have been broken into and products stolen, and various hotels and lodges have been taken over by the rebels. Caretaker President Michel Jotodia has however promised that an action plan is already underway to ensure that the rebels lay down their arms, then be integrated in the National Army before they move back to their barracks. Others who will not be willing to join the army will be paid for their service.
Notre programme est ambitieux et qui nécessite.
We know our program is ambitious and it needs a lot of money, but we think we must depend on ourselves first before involving the international community. This is what we are doing right now.
Compter sur nos propres efforts.
But for Christian and hundreds of other businessmen and women in the Central African Republic, the sooner the rebels are out of the streets, the better for them, as they want their businesses up and running again. And they are calling on the international community not to watch from a distance as their country disintegrates.
And some of us who are from here, we really pray that the international community should not let this country just collapse. because it's very dangerous for the region and even for the peace around the world.
They take what they want at their own will, and when you refuse, they threaten to kill you. Now investors want action to be taken sooner rather than later so that things can get back to normal and their businesses up and running. Kofam Ranger, CCTV, Bangui, in the Central African Republic.
Africa's iconic leader Nelson Mandela will mark his 95th birthday in July. And as part of the build-up, a large portrait of the former president by South African artist Paul Blomkamp is up for sale. Despite 3 international offers to purchase the painting, Blomkamp insists on holding out for a South African offer. Susan Mwangeli reports.
The South African artist has created what he believes is the biggest ever portrait of the former statesman. He says it measures 4.2 by 4.2 meters in size.
I'm painting an energized stripe of love, and the blue could be of peace, that could be of forgiveness, another. And it's the way I'm putting these qualities together to make a complete painting. And Madiba and lots of amazing people, they know how to put these qualities together and become amazing beings that offer hope and optimism for all of us.
The Mandela portrait will be auctioned in a month's time. The artist says it took 14 months to complete the artwork, which consists of acrylic paints on 9 individual canvases.
3 paintings comprise 9 canvases each, so we have to erect this on a little framework, take them up, take them down. We have to put the chin at the bottom and the head on top, and because I can't fit it all in at one go, there's a lot of sort of rearranging. But whatever I'm painting up there, what I'm painting down there might come only 6 months later, but it's still got to be connected. So you've got to think a year ahead of what you're doing.
The Mandela Project isn't the first big project by Blomkamp. He has also created paintings of Oprah Winfrey and Richard Branson. Although Blomkamp has been getting offers from abroad, he hopes to sell the portrait to a local buyer. He, however, hopes it could ultimately be donated to the Nelson Mandela Children's Hospital, which will soon be built in Johannesburg.
We could get a buyer who would be wonderful enough to donate it to the new Nelson Mandela Hospital. And, you know, we've got our children who will go to the hospital, but in 10 years' time, 50 years' time, in 200 years' time, little people are going to go and see this amazing smile and his energy will still radiate out to them.
Blomkamp found acclaim at the age of 19 when he was commissioned to produce the largest stained glass window in the world. He is currently working on another Mandela-inspired project dubbed Mandela Head in the Karoo, which will be an arrangement of shrubs in a 50 square kilometer replicate of the face of South African freedom hero. Susan Mwangeli, CCTV.